right, so welcome everybody. This is week 5 of the solar weekly Zoom sessions. And as we are just talking about, for those who are in the SOPEC group, we're looking at, there will be the hands-on um, and the exam review. And if I recall right, and I'm probably going to mess everybody up, but you said it was October 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And October 1st and 2nd are going to be the hands-on, but you don't have to attend both days. So we're breaking the group into 2 parts, and we're going to have to let you guys internally figure out, get yourselves sort of split half and half. Ideally, it doesn't have to be exact, but close enough. That way we'll have access to all of the labs. But half of you will do the labs on the first, half will do it on second, then we'll all come together on the third and do the review and then take the certification exam. Then, penciled in tentatively, November 8th and 9th, which is a weekend, we'll get together and do a capstone type project where we're going to go and actually install a system. And again, I'm sure that's internal for you guys, not mandatory from my perspective, and certainly not from the certifications perspective, but still a nice thing to do. And I know you have no other plans for the weekend, so why not, right? Okay, so before I jump into the chapters that are aligned with this 5th week, does anybody have any questions? Anything that you came across as you were studying that confused you, or you wanted more clarification, or you wanted to share a brilliant insight that you had while you were going through this? Give you just a second to come forth. Okay, so I'm showing on our schedule that we're chapters, is it 8 and 9? I think it was on wiring and also on batteries or energy storage systems. That's kind of loosey-goosey. Last week we did the what many consider to be the hardest of the math problems. So if you're having trouble with that, just review the session from last week where we walk through doing the string calculations, doing the sizing of the array. Those are the ones that people oftentimes have problems with. Today, though, I wanted to talk a bit about wiring, sizing the wire. So let me, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the whiteboard here. Hopefully you guys can see a whiteboard. I can see you, Dakota. Can you give me a thumbs up if you see the whiteboard there? All right, great. All right, so with the solar array, what we're normally dealing with, and I'll draw a traditional string inverter system. This is getting to be less and less common. More and more often now, we'll see that you'll be working with microinverters or with power optimizers. But the string calculations, this is good for sizing wire because it's the most complicated. So from here, let's just assume that I'm coming in with 3 strings. So I've got 3 strings from my array. Doesn't really matter how big these strings are at this particular moment, but let's assume that it has an ISC. The ISC is the theoretical maximum amperage that a solar panel has. And a string, by definition, is a group of solar panels connected in series. So you're going positive to negative, positive to negative. Well, when you hook up something in series, the voltage increases, but the amps remain the same. So if the ISC of one panel is going to be the ISC of the entire string, right? Because the amps don't change when you hook it up in a string. So let's just assume this string, I'll just pick a number that's relatively close to what's out there now. Let's just say it's 9.6 amps. So that's the ISC of the string. I've got 3 strings coming in, and I'm going to hook them into a combiner box. So I'll just call that the combiner box. And the purpose of a combiner box is to make parallel connections. So I'm going to connect these strings together in parallel, which is positive to positive, negative to negative. So think of it just sort of like a glorified wire nut. You know, if you're doing any connections, you're going to take the black wire, hook it to the black wire with a wire nut. That's a parallel connection. So I'm going to hook them up. We actually do it a little more elegantly than that. they'll go to a bus bar or something, and usually the positive has some sort of overcurrent protection, like a fuse or a breaker. So you're going to come in and you're going to make parallel connections. Well, from that point forward, we're only going with one string, one positive, one negative. It's going to have a higher amperage because when you hook things together in parallel, amps increase, but voltage remains the same. Now, the next thing we're going to come to, you could have a DC disconnect up there by the array. If it's a ground mounted system, that's fairly common. Rooftop mounted system, not so common unless it's a large flat roof system, because if it's a regular residential home, you've got your solar array up there on the roof. You're not going to climb up on a ladder to turn it off. So your DC disconnect, you're going to have a DC disconnect that's connected down here. And the rules, the NEC requires that it be within 10 feet of your inverter. So normally in today's marketplace, the DC disconnect is physically connected to the inverter. That's pretty common. You just get an inverter, it's got a DC disconnect connected there, and you're just going to connect into the DC disconnect. From the inverter, we'll typically go to an AC disconnect. That AC disconnect has to be out there, located outside within 10 feet of your meter. And the reason for that is because if a first responder or the electric company comes to deal with your home, let's say your house is on fire, it's the middle of the afternoon, the first responders come. The first thing they do is they go and they pull your meter or they turn off your power at the meter so that there's no electricity in the house. Well, on the meter, there's going to be a little note or sign that says, hey, warning, there's a second power source here, the PV system. So they're going to look around. If it's within 10 feet within visual sight, they're going to see the AC disconnect. The AC disconnect says this is the main disconnect for the PV system. So they'll go over, it's got to be externally operable and it's got to be well marked and it's got to be close to that meter. That's why you do that. So we go from the AC disconnect and we go back inside the house and we're going to go to the service panel. Now, typically you're going to do a load side connection, and that's on the customer's side of the main breaker. So the main breaker is going to be up here. Anything on the customer's side is considered a load side connection. And then the main breaker goes out and connects to the meter. And then, of course, the meter goes out and connects to the transformer up there on the telephone pole. So this is a typical string inverter system. Those are all of the bits that are part of it. So what we're trying to do here with this particular exercise is size the wire that's going to be used within that system. So I've already told you that the array has 3 strings and it's 9.6 amps for each string. Well, the NEC has what they refer to as, it's the NEC safety margin. So what they say is right off the bat, take and multiply that times 1.25, because they want you to oversize your wire. They want you to give yourself a little bit of leeway. So every piece of wire, regardless of whether it's solar, whether it's just basic household electrical, you got to put in the 1.25 safety margin. So we're going to say, I'm going to grab my calculator here. And so I'm going to take 9.6 amps times 1.25, and I get a 0. I don't know why that is, times 1.25. Yeah, 12. Okay, so 12 amps. So the wire has to be big enough at least to handle 12 amps. Well, if you look up in your book, there's a table, and I think it's page, let's see, where is that table? It used to be page 111. Let's see if it's still page 111. I used to have all these memorized. If somebody is looking in their book, what we're looking for is the ampacity table. Yeah, it's page 111.
Yeah.
All right, so if you look at page 111, you'll see the ampacities. Now, the ampacity, today's market, solar panels typically come with 12 gauge cables. So they're rated for 20 amps if you look at the first column. So the question would be, all right, is that, so that's what we're going to be dealing with there. Well, if the 12 amps certainly qualifies, but before you get to your first electronic piece of equipment, the NEC requires for solar that we put an additional 1.25 safety margin. So this is the NEC. This is for all wire. For solar, before you get to your first piece of electronics, you need a second 1.25. So I'm going to take 12 and I'm going to multiply that times 1.25 and I get 15. All right, so even though the maximum amperage that that panel could generate is 9.6, I've got to have, that's under standard test conditions, by the way. I've got to have wire that can handle 15 amps. Okay, and the reason why is with the NEC, they just want there to be a safety margin, right? Every wire got to have a safety margin. But with solar, remember the ratings for the panels are at STC. STC assumes a couple of things. It assumes 25 degrees Celsius as a temperature, and it assumes 1,000 watts per square meter as a radiance. Well, temperature primarily affects voltage, but it does affect amps. So if it's colder than 25, which of course often it is, 25 degrees Celsius is 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can get significantly colder, especially on a winter's day. So that's going to increase the amount of amps. It's also going to increase the amount of volts. The other thing is a radiance. Now we're assuming 1,000 watts per square meter, but I've been out in the field and taken measurements of 1,200, on a nice clear day. The solar constant at the outside edge of the atmosphere, it's going to be about 1,360 amps per square meter. So we lose a bit as it goes through the atmosphere, through reflection out into space or absorption within the clouds, things of that nature. So they're just saying on a normal day, 1,000, but nice, clear, sunny day, it could be more, could be 1,200. So they're saying give yourself another safety margin, right? Another 1.25, just in case conditions are better. So now we're pushing it up to 15 amps. Well, if you look at that table on page 111, 12 gauge wire, well, will 12 gauge wire handle it? Yeah, it certainly will. If you're reading in column 1, 20 amps, well, we're only 15. So one of the reasons why the panels come with 12 gauge wire is they don't have to be bigger. Everybody's cheap, right? They're all trying to get by with the least expensive. So the panel is going to come in. It's going to be 12 gauge, and it's going to be rated for 20 amps. And we always read from the first column because every circuit goes from a connector. So let's say it's a bolt or a bus bar or something in here, and then it goes to another connector. So you got to worry about the rating, the amp rating, not only for the wire, which we're getting off that table on page 111, but what's the rating for this connector and what's the rating for that connector? We don't know what the heat rating is. If you look in that table, you'll see that there's a 60 degrees Celsius, so a low temperature cable, a medium, I think it's 75 degrees Celsius, and then there's 90 degrees Celsius. And the higher the temperature rating, the more amps it will carry. But we can't assume anything. We have to assume those connectors might be the lower temperature rating. So always get your ratings from the first column. Even if you're using a high temperature wire, even if you're using like PV wire or used to wire, and it looks like when you're looking it up in the table, it's going to be rated for 30 amps, assume 20 amps. Take your reading from the first column. That way you're always going to be safe because we don't know what those terminations are. And even if we know what those terminations are, the equipment may be swapped out at a future date. So, you want to make sure you're just always safe if you do it that way. All right, so we've got 20 amp wire here. We're running 15 amps on it. So if we come into the combiner box, if that wire is being terminated at a fuse or a breaker, you want to round up to the next commercially available fuse or breaker. Well, fuses and breakers, they at that level come in at 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. Then I think they start jumping in tens to 60, 70, 80, and so on. So they make 15 amp breakers. They make 15 amp fuses. So if you're going to put a fuse or a breaker here in this combiner box, you would have three 15 amp breakers, or six if you're putting a breaker on both the negative and the positive. Okay, but now we're making a parallel connection. So what would be the ampacity of the wire leaving that combiner box? Well, there are three strings, 15 amps each string. So this wire needs to be rated for 45 amps. All right, does that make sense? So we look up on the table, page 111, and we find a wire that's rated for 45 amps. Well, we're going to look in column 1, and we'd have to go with 6-gauge wire because 8-gauge wire is only rated for 40, 6-gauge is rated for 55. So at this point, we would spec out 6-gauge wire. And that's rated for 55 amps. Fair enough. So we're going from 12-gauge wire that came with the panels, and we're jumping it up to 6-gauge wire. Now we come to our DC disconnect. Well, this DC disconnect has to be rated. It has an amp rating as well. Oftentimes, your DC disconnects are going to be 30 amp, 60 amp, 100 amp, 200 amp. So those are the standard sizes we're dealing with. All right, so in this case, we better make sure that box is rated probably for 60 amps. It's got to be at least 45. If it's rated for more, no problem. And if you're thinking that you're going to size your system, remember, I think a week or two ago, I told you, when you're sizing the wire, when you're sizing your system, do it based on the maximum capacity of the roof, ideally. If you think that's even an option, there may be cases where it's simply never going to happen. But for a house, if we'd want to size the wire and the disconnects so that if we maximize the roof space with solar panels, we'd still be all right. So you might go bigger, but in this case, let's assume that's the maximum. All right, so we come to the 60 amp DC disconnect. Now we go into our inverter. So what happens in the inverter is we switch from DC to AC. That's the primary function of the inverter, right? We're taking it from DC power that's coming from the array. We're turning it into AC power that we can use in our outlets. So what size inverter should we use? Well, we don't really know the size of the array because I didn't spec that out. All I told you is that it had a 9.6 amp. So let's just assume, I don't know, let's say we're using 400 watt panels. So if I've got a 400 watt panel, I'm going to divide it by, let's say normally if I do this, I try and find real numbers. So let's say that it's going to be, 42 volts. And so more or less, let's say it's 10 panels, right? 10 panels. So we're 30 panels, 3 strings of 10. Well, when we hook up, if the VOC is going to be, if it's 42 volts, VOC is probably about 46 volts. VOC, 10 of them, voltage goes up. So each of these strings is going to be in the neighborhood of 460 volts. Okay, if I have 10 panels and they're 400 watts each, or 30 panels and they're 400 watts each, if my mind serves me, that's going to be a 12 kW system times 30, 12 kW. Yeah, so it's a fairly common size 12 kW. So my solar array is 12 kW. This isn't that unusual for a relatively good sized home. 12 kW, 10 kW, this would be a bit of a McMansion, but that's not that unusual, especially if you've got a car charger or something like that. All right, so we just decided this is going to be a 12 kW system. What size inverter do we need? Logic would tell you that you're going to be dealing with a 12 kW inverter, right? All the power that's leaving the array goes through the inverter. Some of it go to the loads, most of it to the loads. But if the loads don't need it, that power is going out to the grid. So all the power that the array is producing is always flowing through the inverter. It's just some goes to the load, some goes to the grid. That's just what's going to happen. So all of the power from the array is always being used by somebody. So what size? Well, 12 kW. That makes logical sense. But in today's market, we don't need it that big. And the pricing structure is such that it may be better economically if we don't put in a 12 kW inverter. There will be no problem if you put in a 12 kW. No problem if you put in a 15 kW. It's just that you're going to be spending money that you probably don't have to spend. So what is the ideal ratio between the array and the inverter? Well, in today's marketplace, we usually figure about a 1.2 to a 1.3 inverter load ratio. So if I have a 12 kW, a 1.2 inverter load ratio would mean I'd have a 10 kW inverter. If I have a little bit smaller inverter, I would have a 1.3, maybe even a 1.4 inverter load ratio. Now, I'll give you a good reason why you might want to go with a little bit smaller. And I'll get to that in a minute. But it may be that that's maybe the best deal that you find is a 10 kW inverter. Let's just assume that's the case. So I found a 10 kW inverter. Well, no problem. That's what we're going to go with. So what is the output of a 10 kW inverter? Now what we're trying to figure out is what size wire do I put here leaving the inverter? Well, the best way to do it would be to look at the spec sheet and just say, what's the maximum amperage that this inverter will kick out? But we already have all the information we need to do that. I can just take, because watts equals amps times volts, so I'll just say this is 10,000 watts. What's the voltage? Well, this is a single phase grid tied system, so I know in America it's going to be 240 volts. So I take 10,000 divided by 240, and I get 41.67. So 41.67 amps. Remember, I've got to multiply that by 1.25 because of the NEC safety margin. So I take that times 1.25, and it's 52 amps. Well, guess what? 6-gauge wire still works, right? Because it's rated for 55 amps. So good news. I just had to buy one roll of wire. I didn't have to change the wire. So I know this is going to be number 6, AWG. Now, one of my rules of thumb for smaller systems is never use any wire smaller than 10 gauge. Even if you could get by with smaller wire, you've done all of your homework and you find that I'm never going to go over 20 amps or whatever, I would still say go with 10 gauge. The difference in price is minimal, solves a whole world of hurt. So go with the bigger wire. Okay, you saved $50 by going with 12 gauge instead of 10 gauge, but then you forgot to figure out, conduit fill ratios or it's exposed to sunlight, so it's heating up, or you just forgot something, or maybe you add a couple of panels later and the wire is bigger. So go with 10 gauge. it's just a good practice. All right, so
I
we're
have
in
a
here.
quick
Yeah,
question.
sure.
When do we multiply by 1.25 a second time? How do we
Oh,
defer? How do
yeah,
we
it's
yeah.
really when you multiply by the second 1.25 until you get to the first electronic piece of equipment that's going to control the power. So in this case, the inverter is a piece of electronic equipment. So we no longer have to do that second 1.25 because that piece of electronics is going to mitigate the output of the device. So what you're worried about is there be some surge of power coming from all of a sudden there's no, it's a beautiful winter's day and you get too much power. The reason I say the first piece of electronics is if you've got a power optimizer up here and it's connected to the panel, well, then you never use that 1.25 because the optimizer is going to control the output. The same thing with a microinverter. If you're dealing with a microinverter, well, that's the first piece of electronic. The panel's connected directly to it. So the second 1.25 is never a factor. It usually is only a factor when you're dealing with string inverters. So you just keep multiplying until you get to the inverter. And from that point forward, everything's going to be controlled by the inverter. Yep, I probably should have mentioned that. So, all right, any other questions as we Okay, so we're moving forward. Now my drawing starts to get more and more complicated because I keep writing all over it. We're still 52 amps, so we're going to go with 6 gauge. We come to the AC disconnect. Well, remember, disconnects come in 30 amp, 60 amp, 100 amp, 200 amp. So what size disconnect do I need? Well, we're going to be running 52 amps. You need at least a 60, a 60 amp breaker box there. That's really the rating of the box itself. Every piece of metal has an amp rating. Now, if there was going to be a fuse or a breaker inside there, oftentimes there are fuses. I would have to double check. You round up to the next commercially available size. If they make a 55 amp break fuse, that's what you would use. Now, if they don't, and you got to go to a 60 amp as the next available, now you got a problem with your wire, right? Because the wire that we picked is only good to 55 amps. If I'm hooking it up to a 60 amp fuse, or it's the same as not having a fuse, right? The wire is going to burst into flames before the fuse pops. So at that point, I would need to upgrade my wire. I'd have to go to 4 gauge, so it gets a little bit tricky, especially around 6 gauge wire because of the weird 55 amp rating there. So I think they make 55 amp fuses if my memory serves, but you'd have to double check. So if they do 55 amps, fine. You can put a fuse the same rating as the wire, no problem. The fuse is going to pop before the wire is affected. So let's assume we put a 55 amp fuse in here. Well, what's the rating on the other side of the AC disconnect? It doesn't change, right? A disconnect is just a break in the wire. It doesn't change the amperage. So this is still going to be 52 amps. It's still going to be 6 gauge. We just continue. So now I go to this service panel. Well, in this case, I would have to put a 55 amp breaker into that service panel. But that might cause me a problem. And let me jump to another page here. There we go. All right, so let's talk about the 120% rule. All right, so this is for load side connections, and it's fairly common that you get a service panel. This is your circuit breaker box. And the box itself, the bus bar, the little wire, the bus bar that runs down the middle that all the breakers are connected to, has an ampacity rating. So let's say that this is a 100 amp panel. So that's the rating of the box. pretty common in older homes. And let's assume that we have a 100 amp service coming in from the utility, right? From the meter. So this breaker is 100 amps. That's how you can tell. Just look at the breaker. All right, so at first blush, you would say, well, I've got a 100 amp rating of the box. I've got 100 amps coming in from the utility. I can't add any more power to that. It's all filled up. But the NEC has determined that you can actually go to 120% of the bus bar rating in your service panel, because very few times do people actually, maximize their service panel. What we'd be seeing off these breakers is these breakers be going to loads, and these breakers would be going off to loads. And now we want to bring in another breaker. It's coming from our inverter, and we're going to connect it to the same bus bar. So we're going to have power coming in from the bottom. We're going to have power coming in from the top. So what they've said is we can go to 120%, which basically means I could come in with a 20 amp breaker, because now I've got 120 amps coming in for a 100 amp box. But if I do that, I need to locate this breaker as far away from the main on the bus bar as possible. And the reason is they don't want you doubling up loads. So some of the power is going to go to your load that way. Some of the power is going to come from this way, but it's not doubling up. They're not running over top of each other. So if I had located it up here, for example, I might have a big load down here, and 100 amp might be running down here and extra amps coming from there, and I would have exceeded the 120. So as long as I'm feeding, or the 100 amps. So as long as I'm feeding from both ends, no part of the bus bar is receiving more than 100 amps in theory. Hopefully that makes sense. So even if there's one load here, one load that's taking 120 amps, this power is flowing up this way, and this power is flowing down this way. So I'm not exceeding. Down here it's 20 amps, up here it's 100. So I'm good there. So anyway, that's the logic. So this would be the 120% rule. Well, what does that mean? If I'm coming in with 20 amps, what size inverter do I have? Well, once again, we've got all the information we need, because I know that in America it's 240 volts, right? So 20 amps, 240 volts, watts equals amps times volts. So in this case, watts equals 20 amps times 240 volts. So it equals what, 4,800? But, and here's the thing that confuses everybody, remember the safety margin. We can't use all of those amps. We have to give ourselves a 1.25 safety margin. So in this case, I'm going to take 4,800 and divide it by 1.25. And that's going to give me 4,800 divided by 1.25 gives me 3,840. So this inverter, 3,840 watts. So that's the maximum size inverter that I can hook up to a 100 amp service panel with 100 amp service coming from the utility. So not surprisingly, one of the most popular size inverters that's out there in the market is a 3.8 kW inverter, which you would think would be a weird size, right? Why on earth would you sell a 3.8 kW instead of a 4 kW or a 5 kW or whatever? Well, it's because of this. So I can buy a 3.8 kW inverter, and I can hook it up to a 100 amp service panel with 100 amp service coming from the utility. A more common situation is 200 amp service coming to a 200 amp panel. Under that scenario, well, everything would just be doubled, right? So this would be a 7.6 kW. So the largest inverter I could hook up under that scenario would be a 7.6 kW, which happens to be the most common size string inverter for residential systems, 7.6 kW inverter. Okay, so that gets me into, I promised you to say one good reason why you might want to do um, the what they call clipping, the inverter load ratio is, let's say I have a array and it's 10 kW and I'm coming down here, going through my DC disconnect, going to my inverter. Well, I might want to go ahead and put in a 7.6 kW inverter because I then want to hook in load side connection to a 200 amp panel with 200 amp service. Well, what would be my inverter load ratio there? It'd be 10 kW over 7.6 kW, and that would be somewhere around 1.3, I imagine, divided by 7. Yeah, 1.31. Pretty good ratio. That would be fine. So that would be one reason why you would do that. Another reason would be to save money. You know, if I'm looking at this and I can buy a 7.6 kW inverter for, I don't know, $2,000, but a 10 kW inverter was $2,600. Yeah, save $600. You're going to get similar performance out of both of them, which is a little bit counterintuitive. You might think that you're going to need or to you're going to lose some of the power. Let me clear that, and I'll show you why with clipping. So let's use that example. Let's say I've got my daily load here, and I've got a 7.6 kW array. So my daily load would look something like, or my daily production would look something like this. It's a simple bell curve. And right here at solar noon, this is going to be 7.6 kilowatts, right? Instantaneous right there at solar noon on a clear day with a 7.6 kW array. You would expect there to be 7,600 watts of power generated. Now, if I've got an inverter, it's going to go right along that line as well, right? It's going to harvest all of that because its rating is 7.6 kW. So this is the logic that most people want to put into this system. I need a 7.6 kW array and a 7.6 kW inverter so I don't lose any of the power. I want to harvest it all. Okay, so what would happen if I put a 10 kW array with that 7.6 kW inverter? Well, your curve's going to look something like this. Okay, when it drops to 0, that just means the sun's no longer out. Okay, and this is known as clipping. Because my inverter can only handle 7.6 kW, for that period of time that the array is generating more than 7,600 watts, I'm not harvesting it. I'm not getting it. Okay, so you go, well, that's bad, right? I don't like that. But notice what you are getting is you're getting all this extra power on the shoulders that you weren't getting if you had the smaller array. So you are harvesting more power by having that bigger array, even though you're clipping at the top. So even on a standard test condition day, you're still probably getting close, similar, maybe even a little bit more by having a bigger array. But remember, this is under STC conditions, 25 degrees Celsius, thousand watts per square meter and 1.5 atmospheres. Very few days are standard test condition, right? Most of the time it's going to be warmer. It's not going to be cloudy, so your curves as clouds go, I would say 90-95% of the days, even with a 10 kW array, your production curve it's going to be jagged as clouds come up, but it's not going to exceed 7.6, right? Because conditions aren't ideal. So that's one reason we go with the bigger array compared to the size of the inverter. So this is an important concept to understand because it's so common. We deal with it all the time. You're going to use a bigger array than the size of your inverter if you're doing string inverter systems. More commonly, because we use microinverters more than we do string inverters. In fact, when you look at the statistics, about 60% of all of the residential systems are going to be microinverter. So in that case, we're not talking about those big arrays. We're talking about a single panel and a single microinverter. So let's say that we have the panel that we're going to use. And I think we mentioned this last week when I was talking to Jimmy when we got started. He said right now, because there's such a demand for residential material, because when Trump eliminated the residential tax incentive at the end of this year, he basically put a huge demand on residential system installs up until, say, November. So everybody's rushed out and they bought all the smaller panels. So you're lucky if you can find a panel that's smaller than 450 watts. So let's say we've got a 450 watt panel. So it's going to look something like that. All right, my curves aren't very curvy, but that's the idea. So this would be 450 watts. But a residential system, if you're using the end phase, you're probably going to be using an IQ8, IQ8 Plus. Well, the IQ8 Plus has a maximum of 290. That's its output. So you've got a 290 watt inverter with a 450 watt panel. And that's going to be your situation just because you got no other choice. That's the only product that's available. So that's another reason why this might come about. Oftentimes, too, you might find that they're running a special on a 430 watt panel. Maybe a distributor or a vendor is discontinuing that. So they've just got a bunch of them. They're trying to clear them out. So you find deals like that all the time. So this inverter load ratio is something that comes into play all the time. And just remember that you're not losing power, even though you're clipping it here on a nice day. You're gaining in these shoulders. So that's the concept of clipping. Anybody have any questions on that?
Jay, if you're covering another lesson, apologies, but for my benefit of my team, can you talk about the shoulder curve in relationship to tracking systems?
Oh, yeah, tracking systems. Well, very few of you are going to be installing tracking systems. I think.
Correct, but
Yeah,
you're already there with the concept pretty close right now. Yep,
yeah. The tracking systems, of course, in those cases are really. Let me see if I can kind of visually do it. What Luke means by a tracking system, of course, is a system that's going to follow the sun. Normally, these tracking systems are on a daily basis, so the panels themselves are going to be in an east-west orientation primarily, and you see this a lot on utility scale. So in the morning, the panel's going to be looking towards the east, and it's going to follow the sun as it goes overhead. At noon, it's going to be lying flat, and then it's going to be tracking to the west in the afternoon. Now, that usually will give you a more even um, curve. So for instance, if we had just a fixed panel and it looks like this, with a high peak in the middle in the morning, then if you had a tracking system, it might it might look a little bit more like that, I guess. Maybe would it even be? It might be all the way up. Yeah, so my curve might maybe look like that. Um, so there's an advantage there, of course, and some of it is going to be a matter of you're going to get a lot more power, certainly. Like if that curve, let me see if I can get rid of the one. Yeah. So you're obviously going to get a lot more power on the shoulders here with the tracking system. The problem with the tracking system is it's a mechanical device. And one of the advantages of solar is that there's very little maintenance. So if you've got a mechanical device, it's going to fail. There's going to be maintenance required. So most residential systems, it's not worth the aggravation. With utility scale, yeah, they want to see this power curve broader and flatter. That's another reason why they often use thin film panels as opposed to silicon, because they tend to do better in low light. So they already naturally have a flatter curve of production, where they may not go as high. Their curve might look more like this as opposed to the more traditional silicon curve, um, which it just gives them a better distribution of power throughout the day. Plus, they're a little bit cheaper. Plus, they're made in America, in Ohio, right? At First Solar. So up there in Toledo. Was that what you were wanting me to touch on, Luke, or did you have another idea?
Yeah, and if you hear me, I just add one more thing. So the reason the utilities love this so much, we've been talking about capacity charges in this class and the impact of that. If you look on the x-axis as you go further out in the day, because that's the time of the day, the ability to produce power later in the day during those peaks when everybody comes home at night.
Yeah.
I've heard the utility scale, it adds about a half hour to that shoulder of the power curve, but there's a lot of value in that of when the power is being produced. Um, so that's the real value so you see on the utility scale more and more because of that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because the curve, the load demand curve is changing as well. We used to teach that, let's say goes into demand, and this is something that's becoming a big deal. We've always used to focus on how much production you could have. Now we're starting to see that the utilities have to worry about demand as well as production. But now the individual homeowner has to worry about demand as well, and demand management, because the utilities are starting to put in time of day pricing, or demand charges for commercial systems. So in those cases, you worry about when the power is being generated, when the power is being used. So the old demand curve said, okay, here in the middle of the night, demand's pretty low. People start waking up in the morning, fine. Then you start getting air conditioners and everybody's at the office and they've left the air conditioner on at home. And then you start seeing the demand fall off. And so it was kind of a traditional bell curve, a little bit like that. And so the main load demand was, say, 4:30 in the afternoon. So that was it. But that demand curve is changing as we introduce more and more solar into the array. So now this period of time is when peak solar demand is there. And that's when we get into the duck curve issue. So you say, okay, now I'm producing some, not using as much. So now the utilities demand curve starts to flatten out there in the day, looking like that. And eventually you're going to see it go dip down further and then shoot way up when the sun goes down. So this is the notorious duck curve. Um, so it looks like a duck and the like. So the old pricing scheme was the higher price power was in the middle of the day. Now we're starting to see that the peak load pricing is going to be in the early evening. And what Luke was just saying is if we can shift some of the production into that time period, great. So we'll push it over here where the peak is starting to approach. So oftentimes you might see, for instance, a pricing scheme where they might be charging, let's just say 40 cents kilowatt hour here, 15 cents here, 65 cents here. So during, regardless of time of day, it's going to be different pricing. So if you're doing this, if you're an installer and you're looking at this and you've got solar on your house, this is a real recipe for batteries, right? So you're generating a lot of excess power here in the middle of the day. Plus, if you need power from the utility, it's pretty cheap. So why not charge up your batteries and then just load shift for a couple of hours? So now when I come home, I'm going to rely on my batteries rather than buy 65 cent per kilowatt hour power from the array. I'm either going to buy 15 cents power. Even if I didn't have a solar array, I could just put batteries in there, charge it when power is cheap and use it when it's expensive. No problem. But the other factor is because the utilities are starting to really screw their customers more and more. So in this case, I'm generating extra capacity. They may only be paying me 4 cents a kilowatt hour for me selling it back. And then I have to pay them 65 cents. So why not save it? I just get a better deal. So this is talking about load shifting. This is one reason why we're starting to see that that more than 50% of the systems that are being installed today are going to incorporate batteries. So that's just, there's a bunch of things coming together on that. One is that batteries are getting cheaper. So, why not? Another is that the grid is getting less and less reliable. So we're starting to see problems with reliability. So I want to have some backup. You're just using it like a UPS, right? If my grid keeps going down, and we're going to see that happening more and more often as load demand and supplies start to disconnect within our grid. So that's going to reinforce this cycle of people putting in batteries. And the other one has to do with if you're paying me 4 cents and charging me 25 cents, why would I sell it back to the grid? Why don't I store it and use it? Simple economics are going to dictate that. And if you've got time of day pricing, why don't I do a bit of load shifting and take the power that I've got and use it when power is expensive? So all of these factors are coming together. So another factor that we're beginning to see in this same realm, since I'm on a roll on this, is utilities. They're trying to get a buck wherever they can get it. So they say, all right, I'm going to charge you access fees. Well, they've always charged access fees, right? And for a traditional like AEP in Southern Ohio, I think the access fee is, if I remember, $9.40 a month, something like that. That's not exorbitant. It seems fair. You say, all right, that's the cost of you providing me a connection to the grid. Pretty small price for a battery, if you ask me, right? Because the grid is essentially or effectively an unlimited battery. I store power in quotes when I send it to the grid. I can harvest it back when I need it. Unlimited size battery. I'll pay you $9.40 a month for that all day long as it works, because if your grid's not reliable, who cares what it costs? But now they're starting to push that up, trying to push it up. Some of them are using it as a punitive way of trying to keep people from going to solar. There was a movement, I think, in New Hampshire, not New Hampshire, New Mexico. They were trying to charge $100 a month access fees for people who had solar. My utility, Guernsey Muskingum Electrical Co-op, they charge $47 a month if you have solar and $23 a month if you don't. Well, yeah, $47 a month, that's a lot. That's a lot. If you don't use any power at all, you're still paying them $47 a month. So, I talked to the utility and said, listen, is that legit? does it really cost you $47 a month to hook up each system? You know, because they do have costs of running wire and making sure there's a connection there. But you know, their argument was, well, we don't make as much money off the electricity if you have solar, so we have to cover the cost of that. And I said, well, then why don't you just charge what it costs? You know, if it costs $35 a month to hook up to the grid, charge that. But don't have solar people subsidizing the non-solar, you know. So I mean, we're always accused of leeching off of the others, but it's less the case at this point. So these are all reasons. Well, the thing that's going to happen is if you keep pushing that access fee higher and higher and higher, guess what you motivate people to do? You motivate them to simply not connect to the grid. You know, if I'm already putting in batteries, I can go standalone as easily as I can go grid interactive. So I think you're going to see that happening more and more and more, where residents are going to say, I'm going to go standalone. There are some real viable reasons at the moment. We had an intern where his house was maybe half a mile off the road. The utility said it would be $50,000 to hook up to the grid. Well, you're not going to pay that. You're just going to put in a standalone power system, which is what he did. But some of these data centers are finding that they're having to wait 5 years to get permission to connect to the grid with these interconnection agreements through the various like PJ&M. They're going standalone. You know, they're going to go island. They've got the money to do it. They're simply going to put in batteries and they're going to put in solar and they're going to be isolated from the grid. So we're going to see a lot of that, a lot of these microgrids, but bigger and bigger systems. So I think that's going to be a trend that we see. I saw an article recently that said in 5 states, I think it is, it's already cheaper to put in a standalone system than to connect to the grid. So just with their pricing structure. So the utility system is really, it's to my way of thinking, a dying system. And I really believe that the policies that have been put in place by the Trump administration with all of the anti-wind, anti-solar stuff is going to accelerate the demise of the utility system as we know it. That's the main result of these policies, because we're seeing an escalating rise in demand. The only way we can meet that demand is through wind and solar. If you make it difficult to connect those generating facilities to the grid, you're going to go independent of the grid. It's just going to accept that. And if a company like Apple or a company like Meta or somebody is able to sue the utilities to get access to the utility, like they did with telecommunications back in the late 1980s, where they can pay a fair market rent for a portion of the grid because it is a public utility that's using public right of way, then we start to see the rise of virtual utilities in addition to virtual power plants that we're already seeing with your vehicles. One other closing thought, because we're already at our time. Remember, I'm saying that every one of these systems is going to start, well, more and more we're seeing batteries hooked up. Electric vehicles are nothing more than batteries that drive, right? So we're very close to seeing that the electric vehicle becomes the battery backup system of your home, of your business, of your campus, of your data center. I mean, imagine if Ohio University decided to put electric charging stations in every parking lot, in every space, and 50% of the college students are parking electric vehicles hooked up to the grid. They've got, a free battery backup for their campus. So we're very close to seeing that happen. The technology is already there. Now it's just about standardization and protocols and things like that, because the automobile companies don't want this system to damage the vehicle. So we have to see that the way they charge, the way they discharge becomes standardized. But that's all right. So that's enough rambling. We'll get back next week that will be the final of our 6 sessions. So hopefully you'll have finished up the book by then. And if you haven't, then we'll try and worry about that later. But in the meantime, yeah, then our face-to-face will be in that last week of September, first week of October, depending on which group you're with. Okay. Any last questions before I sign off?
Real quick one, Jay, just with the rise of EV chargers, heat pumps, electrification, are you seeing folks starting to select 400 amp services at the residential level to account for all that?
Yeah, I haven't seen it being installed just yet, but that's something that I anticipate. I mean, we have seen residentials. I mean, back in what, the 30s, it was common to have 30 amp service. Then it got to be 60 amp service. Then in the 70s, we saw 100 amp, and then it became 200 amp as the standard. If you look at one of those like Ford Lightnings, it requires an 80 amp circuit to charge that. So if you've got standard 200 amp service in your home and you stick a Ford Lightning in your garage, well, are you really going to have half your home's capacity charging your vehicle? And if you put two of them in there, you need 400 amp service. So I really think that we're going to start seeing that happening more and more and more.
Thanks.
All right. Anybody else? All right, so we'll see you guys next week. And next week, I'll actually be back in the United States rather than out here in England as it's getting dark. So, all right, take care. Bye bye.
Thanks, Jay. Bye bye.